Welcome to this session. Today we are talking about China's technology for what outperformed the world. We are incredibly welcome. We're incredibly happy to have our speakers here today. Chibo Tang, partner of Gobi Partners China, and Ray Ma, creator and host of TechBuzz China. This session will also be moderated by Daisy Wan, Business Development Director of AngelHub. Welcome our guest. Venture, this session is from Venture Stage of Startup Impact Summit 2020.
So thank you so much, Chibo and Ray, for joining us at Venture Stage. As we know that all of you guys are expert in Chinese technology companies. As China is catching with the world economically and technologically. So which area of the technology industry do you think China has made substantial advantage and advances? How about Ray? You start first?
Yeah, all right. Oh, good. So I think, as someone who's really focused on the public sector in general, so publicly listed companies and larger internet companies, I'm not as familiar with what is going on in the very early stages in the China startup scene. But what I can see generally from the larger companies, what they've been doing is that China is quite advanced in consumer internet trends, specifically in e-commerce, as well as, I would say, content and creation. So let me explain what I mean by that. So in e-commerce, you can see that China has evolved very quickly beyond the traditional marketplace. And two trends that China is very strong in that you yet to see take off in the rest of the world are live streaming e-commerce, and also this model called C2M, which is consumer to manufacturer, where consumers are actually able to use platforms like Pinduoduo, for example, and aggregate demand and shape demand and allow manufacturers to create products just in time, but also conforming more to what consumers want today. And you see more and more companies, not just Pinduoduo, jump into the fray for this trend that I think is very well suited to China because of its complete supply chain. In addition, I think, specifically in sort of content creation and video in particular, what we're calling the passion economy here in the U.S. in Silicon Valley, where there's lots of independent creators who are able to make a living purely based on what they're creating. And you sort of see this in China. I think, as far as I'm concerned, there's more tools, as a content creator myself, there are actually more tools and more platforms and more institutional knowledge, as well as organizations that help independent creators make a living. So you see in China, this is not really technology, but I think it's important to consider that there's infrastructure outside of just the tech platforms that allow creators to flourish. So you see China has a lot more, I think, organized multi-channel networks, MCNs, for example, that allow people to be able to make a living, making videos on Bilibili or live streaming on Kuaishou or on YY or whatever it is that they're doing. And I left China 4 years ago. Before then, I lived there straight through for 8 years. And I'm still amazed at how quickly the tech scene, especially in the two spaces I mentioned earlier, has evolved since I left full time.
Thank you so much. How about, what do you think, Chibo?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Ray is, the two trends that she's talking about in the consumer space. I mean, those are definitely been areas where China has, led the world in the last 10 years and probably going forward for the next 10 years. I think supporting those, China has also been able to build out a very advanced kind of digital infrastructure, I would call it. In terms of payments, in terms of logistics, right? And how technology has been able to help them, create an infrastructure that is, well far advanced than what the U.S. or the rest of the world could have, right? I mean, I think everyone now is aware that China is basically a cashless society.
Yes.
Everyone in the country, there's very little petty theft remaining, right? Because no one carries cash around. Everyone just pays, whether it's at the 7-Eleven or at like major restaurants. They just pay with their WeChat Pay or their Alipay, and that's something that has been enmeshed in everyday life for most Chinese consumers. Outside of that infrastructure, for logistics, everyone's talking about Amazon and Amazon Go and like Amazon Now, whatever it is. That's been around in China for like the last 5 years or more, right? Just being able to get same day deliveries, 1 hour deliveries. Like people, if it's more than an hour, people get upset, right? and it's not just food delivery. I remember in Shanghai, I mean, I was looking, I lost my iPhone charger in my last plane ride back. I didn't have one at home, and I was like, oh man, my phone's almost out of battery. And I just ordered it on Olema, right? And within like 40 minutes, I had an iPhone charger at my door. So I think like the convenience and the way that people live in China is very different from what most people in the West would be familiar with.
Yes. As we so many of us has lived in China, have gone to China before, so must agree that China is very convenient in our daily life in whatever aspects. I mean, food delivery and taxi calling in whatever aspects, very convenient to live in. But many also say that China, I mean, the technology companies, they're good at building platform. They're good at building a social platform, contact, and convenience of the living of the people. But how about research and development? Some say that China actually don't put a lot of resources in research and development, also innovation. Some even say that China may be copying technology from US, from Western world, from Europe. So what do you guys think?
I'll take a first stab at this one. Look, I mean, I think over the last 20 years, and this is, from perspective of Gobi Partners, which has been around and investing in early stage technology startups for 16, 17 years. We were there at the very beginning in terms of when this whole kind of VC and startup scene first started. And look, I mean, the cycle has been that China in the beginning, in the early days, there was a lot of copy to China, right? At that time, it was called C2C, and it was just basically entrepreneurs in China bringing over the successful business models that were already prevalent in the US or other parts of the world, copying them to China, and that's really what the first wave of innovation was about. Today, I mean, I think that trend is almost reversed, right? Instead of copy to China, it's copy from China. And we see that in a lot of, what Ray was just mentioning in terms of like the e-commerce and the social commerce, right? The passion economy, live streaming and such. Like today, like the Chinese government has also put a lot of effort and resources into, funding deep technology R&D, right? Because they realize that in order to be world leaders in technology and just in general, I mean, they need to put more resources on there. And for venture capital and PE, private equity investors, I mean, the big opportunities in the last 10 years were around the consumer platforms, right? So they were more around business model innovation. But since those businesses or those sectors have been more saturated, a lot of those platforms are already matured, and there's less opportunities there. Entrepreneurs these days in China, I mean, they're turning more towards real technology innovation, right? Because there's no more low-hanging fruits to be had. And so for investors like us, I mean, we're also looking more into deep tech type investments, right? We're looking more into B2B applications, right? Because that's still lagging behind in China. But I mean, we're very confident that the next 10 or 20 years of China, they will be able to catch up or lead the world in many aspects.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I also think, there is, I like to cite two examples, right? So on our podcast, we just released an episode about China AI, and AI is one of those fields where a lot of people, there's a lot of evidence, for example, that the fundamental research is still sort of within US borders, whether it be from, actually ethnically Chinese researchers who come and study here and stay here and produce that kind of innovation. But you can sort of see that even though China's share in top research has increased, a significant percentage of it, and the majority of it is still here, especially within companies like Google, Facebook, etc. And you see that, well, number one, I think it's a dynamic situation in the sense that, US, for example, where I live, has a lot of change in its immigration policy constantly. So whether or not it's able to sustain that talent advantage, we don't know. But number two, it's like, just because a company or a country has, invented that fundamental research first doesn't necessarily mean that it will win in how it's applied, right? So just like earlier we were talking about consumer internet, a lot of these things are not necessarily, like building a logistics network, for example. JD didn't have to come up with the, whatever systems or software first, but as long as they were the first to scale it and profit from it, then, does it really matter, right? And also, as as more and more sectors in China are able to benefit from technology, I think you'll see a lot more organic innovation because of just the pure application and the consumer needs that arise. So I think that's one perspective. And another perspective is, even in terms of fundamental research, especially with some of the newer technologies that we're talking about, yes, China was behind in terms of like traditional semiconductors, right? Because it just didn't have the talent or the infrastructure until recently. So versus Intel that started, 50, 60 years ago. But when it comes to completely new technologies, when we're talking about like AI chips, for example, is China necessarily going to be that far behind because everyone sort of in the world is starting at the same time on these things, right? Then it's really up to, is the country able to really attract the right talent, and is it deploying capital and the right resources to have the friendly policies that protect IP, etc. And you see evidence that the Chinese government is doing all these things that, in order for an innovation ecosystem to thrive. I think also, I think one thing that is encouraging is that, so I just reviewed a advanced copy of my friend's book. He's a professor of innovation at Wharton, and he just wrote something on China strategies. And one of the chapters was on Intel, which went into China very early. And one of the things that stuck with me was basically how the Intel, even though, for a very long time, it didn't have a large market in China because they came to China very early on in the 90s, that they still continue to invest. And part of it was because the government officials they talked to were genuinely knowledgeable about the technology and the needs that, the resources they needed to put in, and were committed to making that happen. So again, I think if we take a more long-term view and not just look at, how many papers or where the researchers are or how many patents Google has versus Tencent or whatever. If we take a long-term review, I think China absolutely has a lot of the factors, the ingredients that are necessary for recipe for success. Whether or not I'll get there and how soon I'll get there is a question mark. But I think, yeah, overall, I'm fairly bullish based on what I've seen, and especially I think a lot of us here in the U.S. that have just looked at this immigration policy with a lot of discomfort and a lot of negative feelings, because that's one of the core innovation drivers of Silicon Valley, but that might be taken away. So it's not just China catching up, but also are countries like the US going to willingly give up its lead, right? So it's a pretty dynamic situation.
Yeah, just to add on to that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen entrepreneurs that have started off in the U.S., whether that's through their academic studies or their R&D efforts subsequently. They've because of the the recent environment in the U.S. or the changing policies, whatever the reason. I mean, many of them are actually making the move back to put their headquarters in China or in Hong Kong, right, where they feel like they're perhaps more welcome or they can potentially do more. And obviously, I mean, these days the concept of techno-nationalism is much more prevalent, and I think that that's something that we should all keep in mind as investors or stakeholders within the ecosystem. But like from our perspective as well, I mean, the last 20 years have proven to us is that innovation is multipolar, right? I mean, in the early days, Silicon Valley was very proud in saying that this is like the hub of innovation in the world, right? And that was probably true at one point. But today, I mean, there's so much innovation, there's so much entrepreneurship, there's so much talent all over the world that there's not one place that could claim it all, right? And so whether that's the U.S. leading in certain sectors or China leading in others, I mean, I think ultimately we'll all just have to work together more to build a greater society. And that's a very positive note.
We hope. Not sure that that's where things are headed, but
right.
Yeah. All we know that China actually leading in some areas such as 5G or some consumer platforms. So as China technology companies, they're going bigger and more mature. So they aim to go out of China, just as like TikTok, right? But it's raised some concern in the Western countries, such as privacy issues. So what do you think the Chinese technology companies should address these issues?
I mean, I can talk about TikTok a little bit, right? I'm actually writing a short book on it on ByteDance, the parent company. I'm not an expert on TikTok per se, but maybe more on the parent company. And I don't have a super good answer, right? This is obviously why they hired Kevin Mayer, executive Disney, to head up the business unit and become the global COO. But globalization is a very, very difficult thing for basically everyone, for all tech companies except U.S. companies, right? If you really look at tech companies, the only truly global players have been like from Silicon Valley, like Apple and Google and Facebook and whatnot. So Chinese companies recognize that they really struggle with this. Prior to the recent political tensions, maybe the one that you could cite that has been successful was Huawei, right? But now I'm not sure that would be a great example for most people to cite. And TikTok is one of the products, I think, consumer facing that has done relatively well globally, right? Not just in pockets of South Asia or Southeast Asia. And the challenges around privacy and data protection, I think, is going to be something, because they're the first, right? They're going to have to figure that out, and they're going to have to probably do more because they're the first, and because there is some sensitivity around being Chinese. Let's not deny that there is sensitivity about being a Chinese company, that they're probably going to have to do more than even what I think what typical Western company would have to do. They almost have to go overboard to prove that they are completely separated, that they protect their data. It's on, within whatever soil, that they don't, quote unquote, spy on their users, et cetera, right? So pretty much, I think every week there's new news that apps, for example, are not careful about what they do with their user data. I think overall, there is growing awareness from the consumers, as well as the larger gatekeepers, like Apple, for example, right? Like their new OS tells users more information about what the apps are collecting in terms of personal information. So I think overall the entire ecosystem is becoming more aware of these issues. And it's going to take some time, but for Chinese companies in particular, they're going to have to do like an A+ job in order to earn trust because of the nationality, because of their headquarters. Even if, other people or other apps are also going to be are also not careful with their data. And I also think there is a sort of time situation, right, in the sense that as a user myself, a consumer of like social media and a lot of apps, even though I quote unquote used to invest in tech, spent 15 years doing technology, banking and finance and whatever, I still don't really know how my own data is being handled, et cetera, right? So it takes just a lot of effort for the consumer to even know what's going on. So I think all those issues is not just a sole like party, like, oh, the app company needs to do this. Like everyone needs to become more educated and more aware, including government officials, right? I mean, in the US, I don't know if this was broadcast in Hong Kong, but we all watched with horror as our congressman basically asked really inane questions about technology, like clearly show they didn't know what they were regulating, right? So, yeah. I guess that's it's almost like a rant. I'm just saying that, there's lots of issues. It's not just going to be on the Chinese companies, but unfortunately for them, they're going to have to be, superstar. They're going to basically have to abide by the rules probably more than everyone else.
I'm sure they have to be more cautious. They have to put more effort to show other counterparties or even the governments that they're doing a lot of things on privacy protection, right?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that too well. Were you saying there were a lot of governments are doing a lot for?
I'm sure Chinese companies want to go out of China. They have to put extra effort. To show others that they are doing a lot of things on privacy issues to prove that actually, just not we are from China, but we are doing a lot of things to protect our consumers and customers in that area.
I think that is what they're learning. I'm not sure that is happening as we speak, but I think that is where they're getting towards too, right? So if you read interview, like I just translated another interview with Zhang Yiming, the creator of TikTok, and it's very clear that he understands like globalization is a relatively new thing for Chinese consumer internet companies. No one's really successfully gone to like 2 billion DAU like Facebook has, for example. So it is it's a new thing. And I do think that a lot of the rules that Chinese companies play by in China are not going to apply. And they're definitely going to run into a lot of obstacles before they figure it out. And because companies like ByteDance is on the forefront of this wave, they're probably going to get tripped up the most. I think that's pretty obvious. Whether or not they'll succeed, I think it's going to depend a lot on how other countries react, as we've seen by, Indian government saying, you guys are all banned. So I think it's a very dynamic situation, but so far, because no one successfully globalized, there's no example or playbook that people can follow. I think that's being created right now.
I think maybe I'll just throw in my 2 cents here, just perhaps offer like a slightly different perspective. I think like for companies like Facebook and Twitter, they're considered global companies, right? But how many of their users are based in China, right?
Right.
And so like, so how do you define global, right? So for Chinese companies that are thinking about going abroad, I would actually posit that maybe the smartest idea is not to go to the US first, right? Why don't you go to those China-friendly markets, right? The Chinese government has spent so much effort in, positioning themselves and doing more along the One Belt, One Road initiatives, right? And there are plenty of, large markets that are developing very rapidly, with many of their young, demographics on the internet. These Chinese companies could very well get their 2 billion DAU through the developing markets that are China friendly, maybe in like the Middle East, maybe in Africa, right? I mean, maybe that's a way forward, because at the end of the day, I mean, the U.S. sure, it's like one of the maybe considered by some metrics the best markets in the world, but at the end, there's still just 200, 300 million people, right? And that's probably the size of Pakistan. So, there are many different ways that Chinese companies could potentially grow abroad, and I think that why don't you tackle the low-hanging fruit first, as opposed to going to do some of the the things that are very politically sensitive at this point, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to add to that, I think my friend Matt Sheehan at Macropolo had just I think take that focuses on sort of China-related tech policy, and he had I think earlier this year basically come out with a paper where actually, like Chibo, like what you're saying is true, that actually, even though there is a lot of effort to come to the US, Chinese apps are not necessarily succeeding that much here, with the exception of TikTok, and vice versa in China. Not a lot of US services are succeeding over there, even if they're not blocked, right? So I think that the like key battlegrounds have been in countries like India, which are on a development curve where they are starting to adopt these technologies, and there is a sufficiently large market. But yeah, I think my personal concern would be for Chinese companies would be, are those markets necessarily going to be all, quote unquote China friendly, or are they going to be difficult?
So thank you so much for general questions. So now I have a specific question for Chibo. Many audience, they are actually interested to know more about the investment, during the pandemic or post-pandemic. So do you think COVID-19 really changed people's way of living? In that case, okay, what kind of technology company do you think they would thrive? So they actually change your company's way of focus of investment in the future.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? I mean, COVID is a situation, or I don't know if it's an issue or what you would call it, but I mean, it's a situation where no one's ever like lived through before, right? I mean, most people in our generation, and just like the stay-at-home quarantines, the social distancing. I mean, these are definitely policies that have changed the way that we have lived in the last like 20, 30, 40, whatever years, right? I mean, and everyone is just kind of getting used to this new norm. I think a lot of people are still in denial, to be honest. They just kind of, like, maybe I can still go about life the way, it was last year. I'll still go to the beach, I'll still go to sporting events, whatever. Take my chances. And probably some people in government are still having, these kind of thoughts. But I think for a lot of us, especially here in Asia, I mean, like, we realize that this is going to be a crisis or a situation that we have to, live with probably for like the next year or two at least, until there is a vaccine. And so how that impacts the way we work, how that impacts the way we live, I mean, like, we're all kind of just finding our own, new routines. And finding different solutions to help solve the problems that arise. For startups, I mean, obviously the macro environment is very different from what it was a year or two ago, right? In terms of whether that's in terms of fundraising, the capital markets, or whether that's in terms of the actual business, right? For companies that were in like offline retail, for example, there's nothing in offline retail much to do anymore, right? And even though the economy is slowly opening up, people starting to get out a little bit more. I mean, I think that that's something that a lot of startup and business owners need to think about. But at the same time, like, and for we've invested in some offline retail type companies, right? And at the same time, it's not like we're going to tell them, actually, you know what, just scrap all of your offline retail stores, and we're going to change into become like an e-commerce store, right? I mean, that's probably just not like the right thing to do, because at some point, life will, come back to some version of like the old normal, right? And so like if you were experience-based retail, then that potentially could still have demand once we're out of this. But at the same time, I mean, like how do you survive through COVID and make it to the light at the end of the tunnel? A lot of that has been through survival mode, right? Almost just like cutting back costs, just thinking about how to extend the runway, talking to existing investors. And some of it has been through, like some business model adaptations, right? So like we've had companies that were previously doing, crowdsourced logistics. And, they've realized that, okay, well, actually some of the merchants that we've been helping with their logistics, because some of them are offline, I mean, they don't have as much business, right? So maybe we could use our platform, our users and our traffic to help them move some of their products. So they began to add, e-commerce elements to their own business. And so it's just, just finding different ways to leverage the new opportunities that arrive, while cutting back on, overspending on some of the old business models that are no longer as relevant. So, those are just things that, we've seen on the ground here.
Thank you so much, Chibo. And I have a question for Ray. So as you are in US now, you've been living in US for long. So what do you think is the impression of Americans towards Chinese technology companies? So as we have discussed that TikTok is actually very popular in the West. So I believe many other Chinese technology companies, they also want to have an international expansion. So what is the West impression towards these companies? So how do you think they can stand out and then compete with the counterparties in the US or Europe?
How Chinese companies can come here and compete in the West?
Yeah.
Well, Chibo thinks they should go to the other markets, which I also agree, by the way. So, well, if they were to come to the U.S., right? So like you said earlier, and I think as everyone knows, TikTok is quite popular here, but that is sort of one sole example of a mainstream product that's very popular here. I think. Even speaking of TikTok, it's really mostly popular with Gen Z and maybe what I call the younger millennials, right? So a upper millennial like myself isn't really spending too much time on the app or creating content on there. I think that, for any company to come here, it's really, is it the right time now? Well, number one, there's COVID. So if you somehow have spare resources and you're, kicking butt in your home market and you want to expand, maybe it really depends on what your competitive advantage is. I think most Chinese companies, though, have really been stuck on, even if their product has some good, product market fit, theoretically, they're finding a lot of trouble localizing the operations, right? So you can see this you can see that TikTok, actually, the reason why they're able to do well is because they have very good localized operations. And this is, one of the things that the company has said we excel in and we want to excel in, right? So I think they could probably still do better, but you see that for the US, they were able to make very quickly decisions on Black Lives Matter. So here in the US, that happened, and TikTok within 2 days had set up a fund, had decided to make one of the holidays related to this event, a corporate holiday, has set up a separate page within the app. These are only able to happen for such a global product if there is decentralized operations and the local team is given the autonomy to make those decisions, right? So I think a lot of Chinese companies, because they have not operated across so many countries, are not set up yet to do that. So in order for them to succeed here, they definitely need to have some version of decentralization. At the same time, I think when two people do localize, they need to also be aware of what they're localizing away, right? So you can't localize everything. An example of the opposite direction is, again, in my friend's book on, entering China. One of the examples he mentioned that really stuck with me was on Norwegian cruise lines, and they actually over localize for the market. So they put like karaoke rooms and mahjong tables and whatever in the gambling centers in their cruises, when actually Chinese consumers were looking for like having high tea, with like white gloved waiters, right? So when you do localize for the market, you want to localize the operations, but you also want to make sure that you retain whatever it is that's competitive about you. Luckily for TikTok, right, the competitiveness was the algorithms, right? So they didn't have to change that, and their UI was already well suited for like large screen phones and Gen Z consumers, so they didn't have to do any of that. But for any other Chinese company, if they want to come here, I think you have to be, like I said, very clear on what part of your product you want to localize, and then give your local team the clear autonomy that they can respond to market conditions, right? I can tell you that for TikTok, my personal observation is that because of the political upheaval during the last month, and how TikTok was able to quickly respond to it, they were really able to gain a whole different audience aside from, what here people mostly associated as TikTokers, which is like dancing and lip syncing teenagers, right? And now all of a sudden, boom, you have a lot of like very politically active, slightly older people, which is great for the platform, right? Because you want to be, as a media platform, you want to be as broad and diversified as possible. So that they were able to see the opportunity and capture it so quickly, I think speaks a lot to how they're managed internally.
Thank you so much for insightful speech about today's session.